hundreds of kilograms of heavy metal violently flipped upside down at terrifying speed, crushing the driver's skull directly into the abrasive asphalt simply because the machine lacked a protective roll bar. This was the gruesome demise of Cameron Earl in 1952. But the most chilling detail of this tragedy? The very first blood spilled in the British Formula One era did not happen during a Grand Prix. And the victim wasn't a superstar racing driver. The man, completely crushed by his own machine, was actually a brilliant intelligence genius. What on earth really happened? The date is exactly June 18, 1952. The specific geographical coordinates point to Nuneaton, Warwickshire, located deep within the gritty industrial heartland of England. This environment is the stark antithesis of the glamorous, sun-drenched European Grand Prix circuits. There are no massive, cheering grandstands filled with wealthy aristocrats holding crystal champagne flutes. There are no waving flags, no international press photographers rushing to capture a victorious smile, and zero margin for human error. This is the Motor Industry Research Association Proving Ground, universally known simply as MIRA. It is a strictly restricted, heavily guarded, and deeply sterile scientific laboratory. It is a bleak, unforgiving landscape composed entirely of abrasive asphalt and cold, hard concrete, designed explicitly for the brutal, uncompromising interrogation of automotive engineering. Here, the raw laws of physics are weaponized daily against steel, rubber, and human flesh in a relentless pursuit to find the breaking point of a speeding machine. The summer air hanging heavily over the notoriously long test straights is incredibly thick and oppressive. It is choked with the sharp, acidic stench of high-octane racing fuel, the lingering aroma of burning castor oil, and the toxic smoke of tortured, overheating tires. Resting aggressively on the harsh tarmac, radiating intense thermal heat into the afternoon air, is a raw, terrifying piece of early Formula One machinery. It is the English racing automobile's R14B. Approaching this mechanical beast with deliberate, calculated steps is a young man, exactly 29 years old. His name is Cameron Earl. Today, he is not here to fight against rival nations for a silver trophy or the fleeting adoration of the global public. He is here to engage in a deeply dangerous, intensely solitary war against aerodynamic drag, extreme kinetic energy, and the volatile limits of mechanical grip. He is acting as a human diagnostic tool, tasked with pushing this experimental, unproven chassis to the very edge of disaster so that the engineers back at the factory can refine their complex mathematical formulas. He lowers his body slowly into the open, claustrophobic, and unforgiving metal tub that serves as the cockpit. Before the massive combustion engine is fired and the heavy wheels begin to turn, it is crucial to critically dissect the horrifying reality of motorsport safety protocols during the early 1950s. To look at the ERA R14B through a modern, safety-conscious lens is to look at a beautifully constructed, deeply volatile, and entirely indefensible death trap. Modern Formula One is defined by indestructible carbon fiber survival cells, structures so incredibly strong they can withstand the direct, high-speed impact of a solid concrete wall without deforming a single millimeter. Today, drivers are securely strapped into custom-molded seats with complex, multi-point safety harnesses. They wear thick, fireproof Nomex suits that can survive the intense heat of a raging chemical inferno for precious minutes. Their heads are encased in impact-resistant, aerodynamically tested helmets, supported by the HANDS device to rigidly anchor their neck and prevent catastrophic basal skull fractures. Directly above their helmet visors sits the thick titanium halo device, specifically designed to deflect heavy, flying shrapnel, and most importantly, Directly behind their heads sits a reinforced steel roll bar, engineered to effortlessly bear the crushing weight of the vehicle if it happens to flip upside down at high speed. Cameron Earl possessed none of these vital, life-saving technologies. The psychological mindset of the 1950s racing establishment was rooted in a terrifying, fatalistic bravery that bordered on institutional madness. Safety was not merely an afterthought in the design process. It was actively dismissed and ridiculed as an unnecessary weakness that added unwanted weight to the chassis. Drivers were fundamentally viewed by wealthy team owners and ambitious engineers as expendable biological components, necessary to operate the complex machinery, but entirely replaceable if broken. Earl sat inside the cramped confines of the ERA, wearing standard flammable cotton clothing that offered zero thermal protection against a fuel fire. His chest was exposed to the heavy, unyielding steering column and the solid wooden steering wheel. His head, the most incredibly fragile and vital organ of the human body, was protected by nothing more than a thin, soft leather aviator cap and a simple pair of glass driving goggles to keep the spraying oil out of his eyes. The open cockpit contained no seat belts, no safety harnesses, and no reinforced netting to keep him securely inside. The prevailing, deeply lethal logic of the era explicitly dictated that it was far safer for a driver to be thrown clear of a crashing vehicle, tumbling freely like a broken rag doll across the hard asphalt, than to be securely strapped inside an inescapable fire. But the most fatal engineering omission of all, the specific, catastrophic design flaw that would mercilessly dictate the horrific physics of this exact day, was the complete and total absence of a roll bar. If you looked at the sleek, silver ERA R14B from a lateral profile, the absolute highest physical point of the speeding machine was not a piece of reinforced structural steel. The highest point of the vehicle was the top of Cameron Earl's unprotected skull. The driver was quite literally serving as the primary structural pillar of the open cockpit. If the car were to ever go upside down, the fragile human spine and the incredibly thin cranium would be forced to bear the entire, crushing weight of the plunging metal beast. Earl firmly grips the oversized wooden steering wheel, his grease-stained hands feeling the familiar cold vibrations of the aluminum chassis. He initiates the complex starting sequence. The massive, highly tuned combustion engine erupts into life with a deafening metallic howl that brutally tears through the quiet Warwickshire countryside. The sheer acoustic volume physically shakes the concrete beneath the heavily grooved tires. He drops the mechanical clutch. The rear wheels spin furiously against the abrasive tarmac, sending up a choking cloud of white rubber smoke, and the heavy machine aggressively launches down the barren test track. He systematically and coldly pushes the ERA faster and faster with every single passing lap. He is aggressively hunting for the maximum threshold of mechanical grip and aerodynamic stability. The punishing vibrations of the incredibly stiff racing suspension shake his entire body, blurring his vision as the primitive friction shock absorbers react to every microscopic imperfection in the track surface. The cold English wind rips past his exposed face, deafening his ears to anything but the high-pitched, screaming supercharger feeding compressed oxygen directly into the glowing engine block. He accelerates deep into a high-speed sweeping section of the MIRA circuit, the engine howling at its terrifying red line. He is traveling at a blinding velocity, perfectly balancing the unpredictable machine on the razor-thin edge of disaster. The bias ply tires claw desperately at the tarmac, struggling to translate the raw horsepower into forward momentum. The exposed exhaust pipes, glowing a dull, angry red from the intense heat of the exiting combustion gases, snake down the side of the car, radiating immense heat just inches from his unprotected arm. Every single human sense is heightened to a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled overload. He can physically feel the tubular metal chassis flexing and twisting beneath him under the immense lateral cornering loads. He can smell the intoxicating scent of castor oil burning off the hot metal surfaces. He can hear the mechanical chatter of the valves dancing dangerously on the edge of destruction. He is totally dialed into the violent rhythm of the machine, navigating the high-speed sweepers with the calculated, flawless precision of a master engineer. Then, completely devoid of any warning, any sound, or any physical vibration to signal the impending doom, the fragile line between calculated control and catastrophe violently snaps. At a devastatingly high speed, the ERA suddenly loses all rear traction. In the rudimentary, unforgiving world of 1950s suspension geometries, there is zero margin for error. There are no advanced electronic traction control systems or anti-lock brakes to digitally save the driver from a sudden loss of adhesion. Whether it is a catastrophic mechanical failure within the steering column, a microscopic miscalculation on the abrasive surface, a sudden drop in tire pressure, or an unpredictable gust of wind unsettling the primitive aerodynamics of the aluminum bodywork, the end result is instantaneous and severe. The heavy rear end of the metal beast snaps brutally out of line. The delicate balance of forward kinetic energy and mechanical grip is irreparably shattered. The rear tires viciously scrub across the tarmac, screaming in a high-pitched protest as the entire car turns sideways, sliding completely perpendicular to its original direction of travel. The massive kinetic energy carrying the vehicle forward is immense, entirely overriding the braking capacity of the primitive drum brakes. The car is no longer driving. It is an unguided metal projectile sliding sideways across the friction-heavy asphalt. The sliding tires, already degrading rapidly under the lateral stress, dig aggressively into the track surface. They act as a fixed, immovable pivot point against the forward-moving inertia of the heavy steel chassis. What happens next unfolds in a terrifying, hyper-slow-motion nightmare of inescapable physics. The sudden lateral friction violently trips the heavy car. The entire left side of the ERA lifts off the ground, completely defying gravity. The suspension unloads with a metallic snap. Hundreds of kilograms of raw metal, a glowing hot engine block, heavy solid steel axles, and sloshing fuel tanks are launched upward into the hot summer air. The machine becomes airborne, surrendering to the merciless laws of momentum. The car begins a horrifying, high-speed lateral roll. As the massive chassis rotates through the air, time seems to dilate into an agonizing crawl. The world completely inverts for the young engineer trapped inside the open cockpit. The blue Warwickshire sky and the dark gray asphalt aggressively swap places in his field of vision. Dirt, small stones, and debris from the floorboard float upward, suspended in the anti-gravity of the terrifying freefall. Earl is entirely helpless. Without seatbelts or a harness to anchor him securely to the seat, the immense centrifugal force of the rotation pulls his body upward out of the cockpit, further exposing his unprotected head and shoulders to the impending disaster. His grease-stained hands desperately grip the heavy wooden steering wheel, not to steer the airborne vehicle, but in a futile, instinctual attempt to keep his body inside the tumbling machine. The ERA reaches the apex of its violent flip. It is suspended briefly in the air, perfectly upside down. A heavy mechanical guillotine hovering menacingly over the unforgiving track. Gravity reasserts its absolute dominance, pulling the airborne mass back down to Earth with terrifying, rapidly accelerating force. This is the exact, agonizing microsecond where the lack of safety equipment turns a potentially survivable crash into a brutal execution. The heavy metal chassis is plummeting downward at high speed. Because there is no structural roll hoop, no titanium halo device, and no reinforced rear bulkhead designed to take the downward impact. The very first thing to make contact with the heavily abrasive asphalt is not metal. It is not rubber. It is the top of Cameron Earl's head. The physical trauma of the impact is apocalyptic, devastating, and absolutely instantaneous. The human cranium is an incredibly resilient biological structure, naturally designed to withstand the normal bumps of human existence. But it is fundamentally incapable of bearing the crushing, concentrated weight of a high-speed Grand Prix racing car falling directly from the sky. As the inverted car slams down onto the track, the wooden steering wheel firmly pins Earl's chest against the rigid seat back. This prevents him from ducking, twisting, or moving his body even a fraction of an inch to escape the descending blow. He is trapped within the rapidly collapsing geometry of the cockpit, forced to absorb the massive, unrelenting kinetic energy of the crash directly with his own skull. The sheer, unfathomable downward force drives his head directly into the unforgiving tarmac with a sickening crunch that echoes across the empty fields of the proving ground. The immense deceleration instantly shatters his cranium. The bone fractures catastrophically under the crushing pressure of the overturned machine, the blunt force easily tearing through the thin, utterly useless leather aviator cap as if it were wet tissue paper. The delicate human brain is subjected to an unsurvivable level of sudden, violent trauma. The horrific metallic grinding of raw aluminum, heavy steel, and shattered human bone scraping aggressively against the rough asphalt fills the air as the wrecked, upside-down machine fiercely grinds across the track surface. Sparks shower the area as the exposed metal frictionally superheats against the ground. The heavy vehicle slides for agonizingly long meters, leaving a dark, devastating trail of destruction before the dissipating kinetic energy finally allows it to slide to a smoking halt. The driver's skull was utterly crushed under the immense weight of the machine. But the tragedy did not stop there, because the victim lying in that pool of blood was not just an ordinary mechanic. He was the greatest mind that ever stole the secrets of Nazi Germany. The man lying motionless on the blood-stained Warwickshire asphalt was not merely a courageous test driver who had pushed a fragile machine beyond its physical limits. The victim possessed a deeply classified, entirely hidden identity that elevated him far beyond the public realm of professional motorsport. The devastating magnitude of this specific loss cannot be measured merely in terms of lost lap times or broken steel. The true tragedy lies buried within the secretive, treacherous shadows of international espionage. Cameron Earl was an elite intelligence officer for the British government. He was a brilliant operative, acting as the ultimate mechanical spy in a high-stakes geopolitical war for technological supremacy. The immense gravity of his clandestine mission requires aggressively rewinding the historical clock to an incredibly tense era right before the outbreak of the Second World War. Between 1932 and 1939, the international Grand Prix racing circuits scattered across Europe were not merely sporting venues. They were heavily weaponized, high-speed propaganda battlefields. During this terrifying window of history, global motorsport was unilaterally dominated by the rising power of the Third Reich. The Nazi regime recognized that supreme automotive engineering was the undeniable demonstration of national superiority. They poured unprecedented, practically unlimited state subsidies directly into two primary German automotive titans, Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union. This terrifying injection of government capital birthed the legendary, chilling era of the Silver Arrows. These sleek, unpainted aluminum machines were monsters of advanced engineering, operating on a level of applied physics that completely defied the comprehension of rival nations. The German engineers were building supercharged engines producing an unfathomable 600 horsepower at a time when other nations were struggling to reach half that number. They burned top-secret, deeply toxic exotic fuel mixtures containing benzene and methyl alcohol that physically smelled like chemical warfare and burned the eyes of spectators. They featured revolutionary independent suspension geometries and sleek aerodynamic profiles shaped in state-of-the-art wind tunnels. These innovations allowed the massive German cars to reach horrifying terminal velocities well over 200 miles per hour on primitive bias-ply tires. The German racing teams systematically arrived at circuits across Europe and humiliated every competitor who dared to line up beside them. They conquered the sweeping corners of the Nürburgring, dominated the dangerous straights of Monza, and even invaded British soil at Donington Park to crush the local heroes. The fiercely proud British racing establishment, a nation of engineers who considered themselves the undisputed masters of the Industrial Revolution, were left completely broken. They found themselves trailing hopelessly behind in their heavy, antiquated, naturally aspirated green machines. The British were being technologically humiliated on the global stage by a rapidly arming enemy, their national pride bruised and bleeding on the asphalt. Fast forward to the desolate, smoke-filled year of 1945. The brutal global conflict had finally concluded. The Allied forces had successfully crushed the Nazi regime, and the once mighty German Empire had been reduced to a smoldering wasteland of shattered concrete, twisted steel, and endless ash. While military generals focused on redrawing borders and hunting down war criminals, the strategic British intelligence sector had a completely different objective in mind. They acutely realized a profound truth about the nature of warfare and industry. While the German automotive factories in Stuttgart and Zwickau had been bombed into oblivion by relentless Allied air raids, the brilliant mastermind engineers who had birthed the invincible Silver Arrows were still very much alive, hiding quietly among the widespread devastation. The British government wanted their strictly guarded secrets. They desperately sought the complex aerodynamic mathematical formulas, the classified chassis dynamics, and the specific metallurgical alchemy that had previously made the German racing cars untouchable. They sought to orchestrate a massive industrial heist to steal the intellectual property of a fallen empire and utilize it to launch the British automotive industry into global dominance. It was a mission of absolute national importance, a chance to definitively turn the humiliating pre-war defeats into post-war supremacy. To effectively execute this highly sensitive mission, the British intelligence community could not simply deploy a heavily armed infantry soldier or a crude military interrogator. Sending a traditional spy to look at complex auto-union suspension blueprints would be an entirely useless endeavor. The technical schematics would just look like chaotic lines on paper to an untrained operative. They needed a man who possessed the cunning survival instincts of a seasoned field agent, combined with the composed demeanor of a high-society British gentleman. But most importantly, they required a man possessing the specialized encyclopedic brain of a master automotive engineer. They needed a ghost who spoke the complex language of physics. They deployed Cameron Earl. Earl was dropped directly into the chaotic, heavily devastated landscape of post-war Germany. It was a terrifying, hostile environment, defined by extreme starvation, deep paranoia, and intense resentment toward the occupying Allied forces. The surviving German population was desperate, the economy was non-existent, and the black market ruled the shattered streets. Earl operated completely in the shadows, navigating the ruined, apocalyptic cities without a military escort or a visible firearm. He was armed only with his sharp intellect, a leather-bound notebook, and a quiet, unshakable sense of national duty. His monumental objective was to meticulously hunt down the elite, Surviving designers, the chief aerodynamicists, and the lead suspension engineers from both the Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union Grand Prix programs. These German targets were not ordinary prisoners of war. They were fiercely proud, arrogant technicians who deeply resented their total defeat. They viewed themselves as elite, untouchable scientists rather than political figures, and they were intensely protective of their revolutionary life's work. They had spent the final days of the war desperately hiding their blueprints, burying classified technical documents in heavy steel boxes deep in the Black Forest, or concealing them beneath the rubble of their destroyed testing facilities. They categorically refused to surrender their intellectual property to the conquering British forces, viewing their engineering secrets as the last remaining shred of their national dignity. But Cameron Earl did not resort to physical violence, military coercion, or the harsh tactics typical of post-war interrogations. He knew that physical torture would only yield silence or fabricated data. Instead, the young British intelligence officer deployed a masterful, devastatingly effective strategy of psychological warfare. He approached these men not as a conqueror, but as an intellectual equal. Earl sat across from these defeated German scientists in cold, dimly lit, makeshift interrogation rooms, surrounded by the immense rubble of their former nation. He presented himself as an absolute gentleman, a highly educated peer, and a fellow devoted disciple of the universal religion of speed. He poured them scarce, highly valued cups of hot real coffee, offered them rare, untaxed British cigarettes, and engaged them in deeply technical engineering dialogues. He spoke their esoteric language perfectly. He demonstrated such an intimate understanding of extreme internal combustion, volumetric efficiency, and exotic chassis dynamics that he methodically began to disarm their heavy psychological defenses. Earl brilliantly leveraged their bruised egos. He perfectly understood that these men, despite their nation losing the most destructive war in human history, desperately wanted the brilliance of their engineering masterpieces to be acknowledged and preserved for history. They were brilliant artists of heavy machinery, and they simply could not bear the heartbreaking thought of their revolutionary, world-beating designs rotting away forever in the ashes of the Third Reich, completely forgotten by the passage of time. They wanted their genius to be recognized, even if it was by an enemy intelligence agent who had come to steal it. Through grueling, exhausting, hours-long sessions of relentless, calculated conversation, Earl systematically broke their stubborn silence. He extracted the heavily guarded, sacred blueprints of the pre-war German racing dominance directly from the proud minds of the men who built them. He mapped out the secretive mid-engine layouts of the brutal Auto Union machines, understanding perfectly how placing the heavy engine behind the driver revolutionized weight distribution and traction. He decoded the highly classified telemetry data, the advanced trailing arm suspension geometries, and the massive twin-stage supercharger flow rates that had given the Silver Arrows their terrifying, unbeatable grip and velocity. He meticulously documented the exact chemical compositions of the exotic fuels and the lightweight magnesium alloys used to cast the engine blocks. He operated with the cold efficiency of a phantom, moving silently through the remnants of the German industrial empire, gathering the vital, scattered pieces of a massive technological puzzle. He visited the bombed-out test tracks. He sifted through the hidden archives that had survived the firebombing, and he cross-referenced every mathematical equation the German engineers gave him to ensure undeniable accuracy. He was successfully executing the greatest, most bloodless intellectual heist in the entire history of motorsport. He was entirely compromising the greatest engineering minds of a fallen empire, using absolutely nothing but his staggering intellect, a calm British charm, and a few packets of imported cigarettes. It was an intelligence victory of staggering proportions. Holding the top-secret blueprints of the fastest machines on the planet, Cameron Earl returned to England, carrying the absolute future of international motorsport securely hidden within his unassuming luggage. The raw intelligence he had meticulously extracted from the defeated German engineers during his extensive European survey was an unimaginable treasure trove of applied physics. The year is 1949. The devastating conflict of the Second World War has finally ended, but a completely new, highly competitive technological war is just beginning. Earl arrives back in a nation that is economically exhausted, still subjected to strict government rationing for basic food and coal, yet fiercely determined to rebuild its shattered national pride on the global stage. In the chaotic aftermath of the conflict, a lesser man with weaker morals could have easily exploited this massive intelligence haul for immense personal wealth. He could have quietly crossed the Atlantic Ocean and sold these revolutionary engineering secrets to the highest bidder in the booming American private automotive sector. He could have brokered a lucrative deal with the massive manufacturing corporations operating out of Detroit. But Cameron Earl was fundamentally driven by a profound patriotism and a pure, burning obsession with mechanical perfection that completely transcended any base desire for financial gain. He did not hoard the stolen German knowledge to build his own private empire, nor did he allow it to be locked away and forgotten in a dusty, restricted government vault in London. He acutely recognized that these closely guarded secrets belonged to the future of British engineering. Instead of seeking international fame or immediate fortune, the young intelligence officer retreated into focused isolation back on British soil. He willingly locked himself away from the public eye and began the grueling, monumental, and tedious task of systematically decoding, translating, and organizing the enemy's life's work. He sat hunched over his heavy wooden drafting tables for countless, exhausting hours, sifting through thousands of pages of complex, esoteric German engineering vernacular. The sheer volume of raw data he had successfully smuggled out of the ruined Third Reich was staggering. He was not merely translating words from German to English. He had to convert abstract mathematics, advanced fluid dynamics, and complex calculus into practical, actionable manufacturing blueprints that traditional British mechanics could actually understand and physically implement in their own cold, damp workshops. He was essentially distilling over a decade of state-sponsored Nazi aerospace research into a singular, highly comprehensive technical dossier. This was an intellectual marathon of the highest possible order. Earl had to thoroughly understand the deeply complex physics behind every single German equation before he could write it down for his countrymen. He had to painstakingly reverse engineer the staggering genius of men who had designed the invincible silver arrows, breaking down their revolutionary concepts into a language that the struggling British racing establishment could actually digest. He spent his nights surrounded by overflowing ashtrays, empty coffee cups, and towering stacks of telemetry data. He was the only man in the entire United Kingdom who possessed the complete, unredacted picture of how to build a machine capable of traveling over 200 miles per hour without violently tearing itself apart. The immense psychological weight of this specialized knowledge rested entirely on his young 26-year-old shoulders. He was acting as the solitary bridge between the advanced science of a fallen enemy and the desperate, ambitious future of his own nation. In the year 1949, the ultimate culmination of this immense espionage and engineering effort was officially published and quietly released to the British industrial sector. It was distributed by the government under a dry, unassuming bureaucratic title, hiding the explosive nature of its contents. However, it immediately became universally known throughout the high-speed racing paddocks simply as the Cameron Earl Report. This thick, densely packed document was not merely a summary of a post-war diplomatic trip or a simple collection of captured enemy photographs. It was a technological earthquake that violently shattered the foundational complacency of the entire British racing establishment. The unprecedented depth of the mechanical revelations contained within its pages were staggering, acting as a massive shockwave that forever altered the trajectory of European motorsport. The highly anticipated release of Earl's meticulous report forcefully dragged the British motorsport industry kicking and screaming out of the dark ages of mechanical intuition and thrust them directly into the cold, blinding light of hard, unforgiving science. The report systematically exposed the most heavily guarded secrets of pre-war German Grand Prix dominance. It proved definitively, with undeniable mathematical certainty, that the overwhelming supremacy of the German machines was not a product of dark magic or unfair financial advantages. It was the ruthless, highly calculated application of advanced physics. The traditional British approach to building a racing car was entirely based on crude trial and error. If a piece of metal broke during a race, the mechanics simply welded a thicker, heavier piece of steel in its place. They were building incredibly heavy, underpowered machines equipped with rigid, solid axles and primitive cart spring suspensions, relying entirely on brute force horsepower and raw driver bravery in a failing attempt to compete against advanced aerospace engineering. The Cameron Earl report completely dismantled this antiquated 19th-century blacksmithing philosophy. The young intelligence officer laid bare the revolutionary secrets of advanced Grand Prix chassis design. For years, the British had relied on heavy, flexing ladder frames that twisted under high cornering loads, destroying handling predictability and violently snapping the cars out of control. Earl introduced them to the classified concept of highly rigid, lightweight tubular space frame construction. He detailed exactly how the Germans welded thin, stressed tubes of steel into complex geometric triangles, an aerospace technique that drastically reduced the overall weight of the vehicle while simultaneously increasing its structural integrity by unprecedented margins. He provided incredibly precise schematics of advanced independent suspension systems. He explained exactly how the German engineers utilized revolutionary De Dion rear axles, complex trailing arms, and highly tuned progressive torsion bars to keep the tires firmly planted on the ground over uneven surfaces. He broke down the complex mathematics that allowed the massive, supercharged German machines to efficiently transfer hundreds of horsepower down onto the abrasive asphalt without tearing their own narrow, fragile tires to shreds or spinning wildly out of control. Furthermore, the legendary report demystified the classified aerodynamic principles utilized by the enemy. He explained, with terrifying mathematical clarity, how the German aerodynamicists had shaped their sleek vehicles in state-of-the-art wind tunnels to actively manipulate the invisible airflow rushing over the chassis. He detailed exactly how to drastically reduce aerodynamic drag coefficients to achieve horrifying terminal top speeds on the massive European straights, while simultaneously shaping the underside of the bodywork to generate downward pressure, forcing the rubber tires much harder into the tarmac for vastly increased cornering grip. He exposed the exotic metallurgical formulas used to cast ultra-lightweight magnesium engine blocks, a material so highly flammable that a single stray spark in the factory could burn an entire workshop to the ground. He detailed the complex chemistry of specialized, highly toxic racing fuels, incredibly potent mixtures of methyl alcohol and benzene that provided immense explosive power within the cylinders, but required mechanics to wear protective masks just to handle them. He broke down the hyper-efficient, massive supercharging systems that forced impossible volumes of compressed oxygen into the combustion chambers, generating a level of violent torque that traditional naturally aspirated British engines could not even begin to fathom. The publication of the Cameron Earl report in 1949 was a defining watershed moment in the long, blood-stained history of mechanical engineering. It instantly became the literal, undisputed Bible of speed for the United Kingdom. It was the guiding light that woke a dormant, struggling nation and provided them with the exact intellectual tools required to completely conquer the globe. Every ambitious racing engineer, every chief factory mechanic, and every aspiring team boss across Great Britain studied Earl's translated findings with an intense, almost religious devotion. Men who previously built cars by raw intuition and pure guesswork were suddenly introduced to the undeniable truths of fluid dynamics, center of gravity manipulation, and chassis rigidity. By boldly stripping the fallen German war machine of its classified intellectual property, Cameron Earl had single-handedly laid the foundational groundwork that would ultimately propel legendary British constructors into total global dominance throughout the 1950s Formula One World Championship and beyond. He had brilliantly leveled the international playing field overnight. His unparalleled, deeply intimate knowledge of these revolutionary concepts completely transformed his personal and professional trajectory. Cameron Earl was no longer viewed merely as a brave, successful intelligence officer who had executed a daring mission behind enemy lines. He was universally recognized as the visionary oracle of high-performance automotive engineering in the United Kingdom. He held the secrets of extreme velocity permanently locked within his brilliant mind. Recognizing his generational genius, the executives at English Racing Automobiles, famously known throughout the fiercely competitive European paddock simply as ERA, moved aggressively and decisively to secure his exclusive services. ERA was a deeply proud, historically significant British manufacturer, but they were struggling mightily to adapt to the demanding new reality of the post-war racing era. They were desperate to reclaim their former national glory and build highly advanced machines capable of competing at the highest possible level of the newly formed Formula One World Championship. They realized immediately that merely reading his published, classified report was not nearly enough. They desperately needed the very architect of the document to directly guide their hands in the workshop. Earl was officially installed as the elite technical consultant and lead development engineer for the ERA factory racing team. He was not hired to sit safely behind a polished mahogany desk in a comfortable London office, pushing paper and offering abstract theoretical advice from afar. His restless mind belonged in the dark, cold, oil-stained garages, surrounded by the deafening roar of raw combustion, the blinding glare of welding torches, and the sharp smell of heavy steel shavings. He was explicitly tasked with directly implementing the stolen German engineering philosophies into the absolute newest generation of British Grand Prix machines. He was responsible for taking the highly complex theoretical mathematics, the abstract suspension geometries, and the advanced aerodynamic concepts of his own legendary report, and physically forging them into heavy, breathing, highly volatile steel. It was the pinnacle of his professional existence. He was a young prodigy, actively, physically designing the future of global motorsport, armed with the greatest, most lethal secrets of a fallen empire. He spent endless, grueling hours in the workshop, meticulously fine-tuning the fragile suspension components, constantly recalculating the aerodynamic flow over the raw aluminum bodywork, and demanding uncompromising mechanical perfection from the veteran mechanics who worked beneath him. He was literally breathing life into the very blueprints he had so carefully smuggled out of the German ruins. He had written a Bible on paper. But in the world of speed, theory must be paid for in practice. Earl decided to step into the ERA R14B himself to verify it, not knowing that human preparation was appallingly inadequate. The fierce, chaotic symphony of tearing aluminum and scraping steel finally ceased. The thick, toxic cloud of dust and pulverized track material slowly began to settle over the abrasive Warwickshire asphalt. The immediate physical violence of the high-speed impact was over. But the true, deeply terrifying nightmare for the 29-year-old intelligence officer was only just beginning. The crushed ERA R14B lay silent on the track, a twisted, smoking tomb of raw metal, leaking fluids, and shattered engineering dreams. Pinned hopelessly beneath the inverted wreckage, his skull catastrophically compromised from the unprotected impact with the hard tarmac, Cameron Earl lay entirely motionless. In the agonizing moments following a severe crash, the absence of sound is the most chilling indicator of total disaster. The deafening scream of the supercharged engine was abruptly replaced by a heavy, suffocating, and profoundly unnatural silence. This quiet was broken only by the sharp, sizzling hiss of flammable radiator fluids and raw motor oil dripping onto the scorching exhaust pipes. In the modern, multi-billion-dollar era of international motorsport, a catastrophic crash of this devastating magnitude immediately triggers a choreographed medical response. Trained trauma doctors, rapid response extrication teams equipped with heavy hydraulic rescue tools, and specialized medical helicopters are deployed within absolute seconds of an impact. The driver is immediately stabilized on the track, their airway is professionally secured, and their fragile cervical spine is entirely immobilized before they are rapidly airlifted to a state-of-the-art neurological trauma center. But this was June of 1952. This was the isolated Motor Industry Research Association proving ground. The dark, unforgiving reality of early Formula One testing was that human safety infrastructure was entirely non-existent. There were no emergency sirens wailing in the distance to signal incoming rescue. There were no white ambulances idling nervously trackside with their engines running. There was absolutely no medical trauma team waiting on standby in the pit lane. There was, shockingly and tragically, absolutely no medical help at hand. Earl lay pinned beneath the heavy, inverted chassis, losing vital fluids directly onto the harsh tarmac. His highly valuable brain had suffered an apocalyptic level of blunt force trauma. In the highly critical field of severe head injuries, every single passing second aggressively dictates the fragile boundary between permanent neurological damage and absolute survival. The brain desperately requires uninterrupted oxygen and immediate relief from intracranial pressure. Yet, the young genius, who had just successfully handed the British Empire the blueprint for global automotive dominance, was left entirely alone, bleeding out in the deafening, suffocating silence of the isolated testing facility. This specific, agonizing reality exposes the most sickening, deeply unethical paradox of the 1950s racing establishment. The British automotive industry, desperate to reclaim their international prestige and dominate the newly formed World Championship, was actively investing millions of pounds into highly experimental metallurgy, complex aerodynamic wind tunnel testing, and the development of volatile exotic racing fuels. They spared absolutely no financial expense in their relentless pursuit to extract an extra 10 horsepower from a supercharged combustion engine. They meticulously tracked the exact degradation rate of rubber tires and the precise thermal limits of their brake drums. Yet, the wealthy corporate executives and highly ambitious team directors categorically refused to spend a single, solitary pound on a basic medical kit or a standby physician to protect the living, breathing human being tasked with operating their experimental machines. Human life was treated not as a precious, irreplaceable asset, but as a secondary, completely disposable biological component of mechanical advancement. Earl was viewed merely as a highly intelligent battery powering their grand technological ambitions, a component entirely replaceable if he happened to malfunction or break under pressure. The staggering arrogance of sending a man to purposefully test the limits of physical adhesion without a single bandage, stretcher, or trained medic on standby is a chilling testament to the era's complete disregard for human preservation. The only people present to witness the horrific aftermath of the rollover were the frantic, completely unequipped team mechanics and testing engineers stationed down the track. These were working-class men trained to calibrate complex carburetors, weld tubular steel, and tighten heavy suspension bolts. They were not trained to stabilize shattered human craniums, manage catastrophic internal hemorrhaging, or clear a compromised airway. Upon witnessing the violent inversion of the ERA, they were forced to sprint wildly across the vast, empty fields of the testing facility just to reach the crash site. There were no radio communications to coordinate a professional rescue, only the panicked, breathless shouting of desperate men running blindly toward the thick column of smoke. Their lungs burned, their minds consumed by paralyzing panic as they finally closed the distance to the smoking wreckage. They arrived at the overturned chassis completely empty-handed. They carried no rigid cervical collars to protect his vulnerable spine from further damage. They had no oxygen tanks to support his failing respiratory system, no sterilized bandages to stem the flow of fluids, and absolutely no medical stretchers to safely move his limp, broken body. The ensuing rescue effort was raw, chaotic, and agonizingly prolonged. Because they lacked any specialized extrication equipment, the mechanics had to rely entirely on their bare, grease-stained hands and whatever crude steel levers they could find scattered around the track borders. They frantically attempted to physically heave the crushing weight of the metal chassis off his completely unresponsive body. The vehicle was a massive, dead weight of hot metal, actively resisting their desperate, adrenaline-fueled efforts to free their trapped colleague. The golden hour of trauma medicine, the critical, immediate 60-minute window of time following a severe injury where a fading human life can potentially be pulled back from the brink through rapid medical intervention, was carelessly squandered on the desolate test track. Every single minute that ticked by while they struggled with the heavy chassis was a minute his traumatized brain was deprived of critical medical support. The devastating delay at the scene of the accident was a direct, undeniable consequence of the institutional negligence that defined the era. His life was bleeding away not just from the physical impact, but from the systemic failure of the very industry he was trying to elevate. Once the exhausted, terrified engineers finally managed to heave the ruined chassis high enough to drag his limp body free from the wreckage, the nightmare merely shifted into its next phase. The critically injured prodigy was hastily, awkwardly loaded into whatever standard, rough-riding transport vehicle was available at the MIRA facility. It was not a specialized ambulance. It was likely a rigid utility vehicle or a standard estate car, completely devoid of any medical suspension. There was no specialized life support equipment utilized during this transport. There were no paramedics present to monitor his rapidly fading vital signs or administer pain relief. The agonizing, bumpy journey from the remote Nuneaton testing facility to the nearest local hospital was a desperate race against a ticking biological clock that had already expired the exact moment his unprotected head made contact with the asphalt. The rough, uneven country roads violently jostled his unstabilized body, exacerbating the severe cranial trauma with every single bump and sharp turn. His colleagues sat beside him in the transport, watching helplessly as the brilliant light of his intellect was slowly extinguished by the blunt force of reality. He arrived at the rural medical facility in a state of profound, irreversible physiological collapse. The local hospital staff, comprised of rural doctors and nurses unaccustomed to treating the extreme, high-velocity, blunt-force trauma generated by Grand Prix machinery, scrambled frantically to stabilize the young man. They were presented with a horrific injury profile normally reserved for severe wartime casualties or high-speed aviation disasters, not standard civilian accidents. They deployed every primitive 1950s medical resource they possessed in a frantic bid to save his life. But the sheer, catastrophic scale of his cranial injuries was entirely beyond the reach of the medical science of the decade. The massive skull fractures sustained on the track had caused immediate, extensive, and irreparable damage to his highly complex brain tissue. There was no modern neurosurgery capable of reversing the severe swelling, no advanced imaging to map the internal bleeding, and no highly specialized trauma techniques capable of repairing the devastating structural damage inflicted by the heavy ERA chassis. Cameron Earl lay there in the quiet, sterile hospital ward, his head heavily bandaged in white gauze, completely unresponsive to any external stimuli. The chaotic noise of the hospital swirling around him failed to register. The brilliant, encyclopedic mind that had successfully decoded the greatest aerodynamic secrets of Nazi Germany, the incredibly sharp intellect that had bravely outsmarted the most arrogant engineers of the Third Reich in their own shattered country, was now permanently locked in total, inescapable darkness. The immense, visionary brain that had meticulously drafted the exact blueprint for British racing supremacy, the brilliant mind that had authored the legendary Cameron Earl report and changed the course of automotive history, was slowly, quietly slipping away into the absolute void. He was not surrounded by cheering crowds, waving checkered flags, or the glorious atmosphere of an international Grand Prix podium. He was stripped of any sporting glory, surrounded only by the quiet hum of primitive medical equipment, the harsh smell of medical ether, and the heavy grief of the colleagues who had entirely failed to protect him. He never regained a single moment of consciousness to understand what had happened to his machine. Lying in that quiet hospital bed, far removed from the violent, high-octane world of speed that had entirely consumed his short, brilliant life, the 29-year-old intelligence operative finally succumbed to the massive, overwhelming trauma inflicted by the metal beast. Cameron Earl breathed his last. But what makes his death a permanent scar on history is the grim title he was forced to carry to his grave. Cameron Earl was forced to carry a profoundly heavy, deeply sorrowful title into the dark earth of his grave. When motorsport historians meticulously compile the official, blood-stained ledgers of the Formula One World Championship, a highly regulated, globally recognized era that officially began in the year 1950, his name sits in absolute, tragic isolation at the very top of the list. He was the very first man to be killed. He is the original casualty. His death marks the very first drop of blood violently spilled in the modern era of the sport. It was a dark, horrific baptism that officially inaugurated an incredibly brutal decade of racing, establishing a terrifying precedent that the pursuit of ultimate speed would demand a continuous, unrelenting sacrifice of human life. But the most devastating, deeply poetic tragedy of this specific historical milestone is the absolute lack of traditional sporting glory surrounding it. When we picture the tragic fallen heroes of Grand Prix racing, our minds naturally conjure images of bright, blinding sunshine on a Sunday afternoon. We imagine massive, adoring crowds chanting their names over the public address systems. We picture heavy laurel wreaths, silver trophies, and the romantic, almost mythical narrative of a modern gladiator dying in the absolute heat of international combat, fighting wheel to wheel against a bitter rival. Cameron Earl experienced absolutely none of this glamorous, highly publicized theater. He did not meet his violent end under the bright, flashing bulbs of the international press. He fell in the heavy, suffocating silence of an isolated, completely barren industrial testing facility deep in the English countryside. There were no grandstands filled with passionate fans to witness his final, terrifying moments. There was no checkered flag waiting for him at the finish line, no cheering podium, and no champagne. He died completely alone, entirely unseen by the global audience he was actively trying to conquer. He did not perish wearing the tailored, bespoke racing overalls of a pampered, highly paid superstar driver. He laid down his life wearing the simple, grease-stained work uniform of a dedicated mechanic and an obsessive, relentless engineer. He was a brilliant man willingly strapping his own fragile body into a volatile, unproven machine, not to secure personal fame or immense financial wealth, but to brutally subject himself to the unforgiving, punishing laws of physics. He was actively acting as a human diagnostic tool, voluntarily absorbing the violent, terrifying limits of applied aerodynamics and mechanical stress. He was desperately hunting for fatal mechanical flaws hidden within the raw steel and aluminum, taking the brutal punishment of the asphalt, so that other, more famous British drivers could eventually stand under the bright lights of the global stage and claim the glory. This silent, devastating sacrifice is the profound embodiment of the unsung British hero. He was a man completely accustomed to operating within the quiet, unseen shadows to deeply secure the future and the technological prestige of his empire. The men who truly change the course of history rarely stand in the spotlight. Earl did not need to be the celebrated hero standing on the top step of the podium. He was perfectly, humbly content being the unseen, silent architect who meticulously built the very staircase they stood upon. He was the great foundational paving stone upon which the entire modern British motorsport industry was eventually constructed. His brilliant mind provided the blueprints, but his physical body provided the heavy, tragic anchor that grounded their lofty ambitions in cold reality. That foundational stone was laid with a terrifyingly high human price. His horrific death served as the very first undeniable alarm bell for driver safety in the newly formed Formula One era. It was a brutal, physical warning sign that simply could not be ignored by the arrogant engineering elite who had previously foolishly valued weight reduction over human preservation. His spilled blood violently exposed the staggering, lethal arrogance of constructing open cockpit missiles without any structural protection for the occupant. It marked the dark, agonizing beginning of a heavily prolonged era where vital, life-saving safety regulations were written almost exclusively in the blood of fallen men. It was precisely because of quiet, unsung tragedies exactly like his that the motorsport industry was eventually forcefully awakened from its dangerous delusion of mechanical invincibility. Every single modern Grand Prix driver who miraculously walks away from a violently inverted, high-speed crash, fully protected by indestructible carbon fiber survival cells and reinforced titanium halos, owes a quiet, unpayable debt of profound gratitude to the terrible price paid by a young, brilliant intelligence officer in 1952. Cameron Earl was the ultimate casualty of a technological war, a man who utilized his staggering intellect to steal the greatest engineering secrets of the enemy, and then, without a single moment of hesitation, sacrificed his own life in the absolute shadows to guarantee the future of his nation. Cameron Earl is gone, but the classified intelligence report he left behind and the tragic blood he spilled on the tarmac planted the absolute seeds for the unbreakable foundation of British Formula One. He was a silent hero who never required a gold trophy or a cheering crowd, driven only by the pure, relentless desire to push a machine toward absolute perfection. What are your thoughts on the incredible legacy of this great mechanical spy? Drop a comment below. If you liked this video, please subscribe to Terminal Velocity so we can continue navigating these dark historical files together. Thanks for tuning in, and farewell.